When I got home from helping my sister, a moving truck was parked in my driveway. My own son came out and told me he had packed all my things and was sending me to a nursing home, all because his new German Shepherd needed space. I just nodded. When my son and his wife tried to unlock my front door a month later, their keys didn't work. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. When I returned from my trip, I never expected my own driveway to feel so foreign. There it was, a big white moving truck parked right in front of my house, the kind of sight that makes your stomach tighten before your mind even catches up. Bold blue letters along the side read, Peterson Moving Services. And for a moment, I just sat there in my old Honda, hands frozen on the steering wheel, staring at it like maybe if I blinked enough times, it would disappear. I had been away for 2 months, staying with my sister Eleanor down in Florida. She'd had hip surgery, and family is supposed to be there for each other. So I'd been there, helping her through her slow, painful physical therapy sessions, cooking her meals, sleeping on her lumpy guest bed, and putting my own life on pause. 2 months without my home, my own kitchen, my own familiar morning routine. I missed all of it. But Eleanor needed me, and I never thought for 1 second that I'd regret going. As I turned off the engine, my hands trembled. The front door swung open. My son, Randall, stepped out carrying a cardboard box. Behind him came Nola, his wife, her perfectly manicured nails wrapped around what looked suspiciously like my best china set. Randall? My voice wavered as I got out of the car. What's going on here? He didn't look ashamed, not even close. He just set the box down on the truck's ramp and turned toward me with that cold, distant look I'd seen too often lately. Mom, we need to talk, he said, walking over. Nola stayed by the truck, but I could feel her eyes on me. I wouldn't have been surprised if she was smiling. Why is there a moving truck at my house? I asked. My voice shook harder this time. Deep down, I think I already knew the answer, but my mind refused to accept it. We found you a place at Sunset Manor, Randall said matter-of-factly, as though he were talking about the weather. It's a nice facility. You'll be taken care of there. It was like the air was sucked out of my lungs. A nursing home? Randall, I don't need a nursing home. I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself. Mom, you're 70. You've been gone for 2 months. Anything could have happened. What if you'd fallen? What if you'd had a heart attack? We wouldn't have known. But I was helping Eleanor. You knew where I was. That's when Nola finally chimed in, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Beulah, honey, we're just thinking about what's best for you. At your age, you really shouldn't be living alone. I searched their faces, desperately trying to find a trace of the son I'd raised, the boy I'd sacrificed so much for. This is my house, Randall. I've lived here for 43 years. Your father and I bought it when you were just 2. We appreciate everything you and Dad did, he said, though his tone made it sound like an empty courtesy. But we need the space now. My breath caught. Space for what? Nola's eyes lit up like she'd been waiting to share the news. We got the most beautiful German Shepherd puppy. His name is Duke, and he's going to be huge. He needs a big yard to run around in, and our apartment just isn't suitable. I stared at her, sure I'd misheard. You're putting me in a nursing home? For a dog? It's not just for Duke, Randall said quickly, though I saw the flicker of guilt in his eyes. Mom, you're getting older. This house is too big for you. All those stairs, the yard work, the upkeep. It's too much. I've managed just fine, I said sharply. Mrs. Patterson next door helps with the heavy things, and I hire Tommy from down the street to mow the lawn. See? Nola jumped in as if she'd just won the argument. You're already needing help with everything. My legs felt unsteady. I turned to look at my house. The home where I'd raised Randall, where I'd nursed my husband through his final illness. The place I'd planned to spend the rest of my days. The rose bushes I'd planted years ago were blooming, their pink petals bright against the green. The porch swing where I read my morning paper still sat in its spot, but suddenly it looked like it belonged to someone else. How long have you been planning this? I asked quietly. Randall shifted uncomfortably. We talked about it while you were gone. It just makes sense, Mom. You've been in my house for 2 months going through my things? We needed to pack your essentials, Nola replied. Don't worry. We carefully picked everything you'll need at Sunset Manor. I walked toward the truck. Box after box was stacked inside, my life reduced to cardboard. I recognized a few of my dishes, some furniture, but so much was missing. Where's my china cabinet? My wedding photo from the mantel? Your father's chair? Mom, you won't have room for all that, Randall said. The rooms at Sunset Manor are much smaller. We kept only what you'll actually need. Something deep inside me cracked. Not my heart, but some invisible piece that had been holding me together for 70 years. When do I have to leave? I whispered. The truck's here now, Nola said, her tone bright, as though this were some exciting milestone. We've already paid for your first month at Sunset Manor. Your room is ready. I stood frozen in my own driveway, staring at the house that had been my world. The house where I had laughed, cried, and lived through decades of memories. Where I had been loved, where I had belonged. In just a few hours, it wouldn't be mine anymore. And without it, I wasn't sure where I belonged at all. A sudden thought slipped out before I could stop it. Can I at least see Duke? I asked. The words surprised me. Maybe if I met this wonderful dog they were so concerned about, I could understand why everything was happening. Nola's face brightened instantly. Oh, he's at the groomer today, getting his first professional bath and nail trim. You'll meet him eventually. Eventually. As though I were some distant relative they might visit once in a while, if they remembered. I stood silently as they loaded the last of my belongings onto the truck, the metallic clang of each box hitting harder than it should. Watching my son direct the movers with brisk efficiency, I realized something I'd been avoiding for months. He had become a stranger to me. And somewhere along the way, I had let it happen. The drive to Sunset Manor felt less like moving and more like a funeral procession. Slow, heavy, and final. The first 3 weeks, they were the darkest of my life. I barely left my room. I survived on the bland meals they left at my door and spent hours just staring out the window at the parking lot below. Everything hurt. My back ached from the narrow bed, my heart hurt from the betrayal, and my soul ached from the complete loss of everything I had ever known. Other residents tried to draw me in, inviting me to bingo games, craft sessions, group lunches, but I couldn't bring myself to care. What was the point? My own son had discarded me like I was nothing. Nothing mattered anymore. Then Margaret arrived. It was 2 in the afternoon and I was still lying in bed in my nightgown when the door opened. A woman about my age walked in, dragging a large suitcase behind her. Her silver hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and her expression radiated quiet determination. Well, she said, giving the small room with its 2 single beds a quick but thorough scan, I guess we're roommates. I'm Margaret Sullivan. I managed a weak smile. Bula Henderson. Margaret set her suitcase on the empty bed, then turned and studied me closely. You've been crying, she stated, not asked. I didn't bother denying it. My son put me here, I said flatly. Took my house for his dog. Ah, Margaret nodded knowingly. Family betrayal. She let out a short breath. I'm here because my daughter-in-law convinced my son I was becoming too difficult to manage. Apparently, asking where my late husband's life insurance money went makes me a problem. Despite myself, I pushed up in bed. What do you mean? Margaret began unpacking with deliberate efficiency. I'm a retired lawyer, Bula, 45 years of practice. When my husband died last year, there should have been a substantial life insurance payout. Instead, my son claimed there were complications and only a small amount came through. When I asked to see the paperwork, suddenly I was suffering from dementia and needed supervised care. She pulled out a thick file folder and set it on her nightstand. The thing about being a lawyer is you never really retire. You just get more selective about your cases. You're investigating your own son? I asked. I'm protecting my own interests, she corrected firmly. Something you might want to consider doing. I shook my head. There's nothing to investigate. Randall was honest about what he wanted, my house for his dog. Margaret paused mid-unpacking and gave me a sharp, assessing look. Bula, whose name is on the deed to your house? Mine, of course. It was mine and my husband's. And when Robert died, it became just mine. And your son just assumed he could move you out and move himself in? When she put it like that, it did sound rather presumptuous. He said I needed care, I murmured. Do you need care? I thought about it honestly. I was managing fine. I'm not as spry as I used to be, but I just spent 2 months in Florida taking care of my sister. If I can take care of someone else, I can certainly take care of myself. Margaret sat down on her bed, facing me directly. Bula, in my experience, when family members rush elderly relatives into care facilities while taking control of their homes, there's usually more to the story. What do you mean? Has your son ever asked about your will, your finances, whether you've made provisions for long-term care? I frowned, trying to recall. He asked a few months ago if I'd considered what would happen to the house when I die. Said he wanted to make sure everything was taken care of. And what did you tell him? That the house would go to him. Naturally, he's my only child. Margaret nodded slowly. So he knows he'll inherit the house eventually. The question is, why couldn't he wait? That one hurt. Maybe he just wanted me to be safe. Maybe, Margaret allowed. Or maybe he wanted the house now, while he could enjoy it. How old is your son, Beulah? 48. Old enough to have his own life, his own home, she said pointedly. Old enough to wait for his inheritance like the rest of us had to do. She leaned forward. Tell me, did he ever offer to move in with you? Hire a home health aide? Install one of those medical alert systems? It hit me then. Hard. No, he never had. Margaret sat quietly for a moment, her brow furrowing in thought. If your mom needs to be in a nursing home, the house must be worth a decent amount, she mused, almost as if doing the math in her head. 43 years of ownership. It's probably paid off by now. Oh yes, I replied, nodding. Robert and I paid it off years ago, and the neighborhood has really improved since then. I could still picture the quiet streets, the old trees, the neighbors who used to wave from their porches. The place had a history, my history. The realtor who used to send me Christmas cards every year always said it was worth around $300,000, I added. Margaret's eyebrows shot up in genuine surprise. 300,000, she repeated. Beulah, that's serious money, she said, leaning forward. Enough to change someone's life significantly. I hadn't ever looked at it that way. To me, it wasn't just a number. It was my home, my safe place, the one spot in the world where I belonged. Margaret's voice softened slightly. Tell me about this dog. Duke, I said. He's a German Shepherd puppy. Nola, my daughter-in-law, said he needed a big yard. Margaret let out a low whistle. German Shepherds are expensive dogs, especially if they're buying from a breeder. Could cost several thousand. Several thousand? I echoed, my voice betraying my shock. For a dog, yes. If it's a show-quality puppy with papers, absolutely, she explained. And that's before you factor in training, veterinary care, premium food. We're talking about a serious financial commitment here. I thought about Randall's job at the insurance company. He made decent money, sure, but not the kind of income that supported luxuries like that. At least not the Randall I thought I knew. Margaret, I said slowly, do you think they planned this? While I was gone. Margaret paused before answering, choosing her words carefully. I think, she said, that you might want to find out exactly what's been happening with your property while you've been here. She stood, walked over to the window and looked out over the parking lot. Her voice carried a sharper edge now. You know, Beulah, the thing about nursing homes is that once you're in one, people assume you're helpless. They stop consulting you about decisions. They start making assumptions about your mental capacity. I frowned at what are you saying? Margaret turned back toward me, and for the first time I saw the lawyer she used to be flash in her eyes. I'm saying that being in here doesn't make you powerless. You still own that house. You still have rights. And if your son thinks he can just take over your life because it's convenient for him, well, he's got another thing coming. For the first time in 3 weeks, I felt something other than despair. I felt angry, righteously angry. What do you think I should do, Atia? Jeff, what a shino, I asked. Margaret smiled. It wasn't the warm smile of a friend trying to comfort me. It was the sharp, purposeful smile of a woman who had spent 45 years fighting for people who'd been wronged. First, she said, we're going to find out exactly what your son has been up to in your house. Then, we're going to remind him that his mother isn't dead yet. The next morning, Margaret wasted no time. She marched me down to the nursing home's business office like a woman on a mission. I'd barely taken 2 sips of my coffee, but she was already dressed, ready, and carrying a thick file folder under her arm. We need to use your computer, she told the receptionist. Jessica, a young woman who looked startled by Margaret's firm, no-nonsense tone. I'm sorry, Jessica began, but residents aren't typically allowed. We're not typical residents, Margaret cut in smoothly. I'm a retired attorney helping my friend with some legal matters. Surely you have some provision for residents who need to access public records. Jessica glanced nervously toward the computer, then toward the empty supervisor's office. I suppose I could let you use it for a few minutes, she said, but I'll need to stay here with you. Perfect, Margaret replied, already pulling out the chair and sitting down with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no in a courtroom. I stood beside her, watching in quiet amazement as her fingers flew across the keyboard. Within minutes, she had the county assessor's website open and my address typed in. "Let's see what we're dealing with here," she murmured, scrolling through the results. When the numbers came up, my breath caught in my throat. The house I'd always thought was worth around $300,000 was now assessed at $450,000. $450,000? I whispered. How is that even possible? Margaret was already clicking on another link. "Property values have been rising steadily in your neighborhood, Beulah. Look at this. Houses on your street are selling for even more than the assessed value." She pulled up recent sales records. "See, the house 3 doors down sold 6 months ago for $500,000. Another house just last month went for $475,000. Her voice turned grim. "Your son stands to inherit a very valuable piece of property, much more valuable than you realized." Jessica, who had been pretending not to listen, leaned forward slightly. "Wow, that's a lot of money for a house." "It certainly is," Margaret agreed without missing a beat. "Jessica, would you mind printing this information for us?" While Jessica busied herself at the printer, Margaret kept typing. "Now, let's see what else we can find. Beulah, you said your son has been living in your house for 3 weeks now?" "That's right," I confirmed, "since the very day they moved me in here." Margaret opened the local newspaper's website, her eyes scanning the classified ads. A few minutes later, she found something, and her lips pressed into a tight line. "For rent," she read aloud, her voice edged with disbelief. "Beautiful 3-bedroom house, large yard, quiet neighborhood, $2,000 per month, plus utilities." I felt the blood drain from my face, my chest tightened. "That's my address." "Your son is renting out rooms in your house," Margaret said, each word clipped and trembling with restrained anger. "While you're in here, eating cafeteria food and sleeping on a bed barely wide enough to turn over in." A wave of dizziness hit me. He can't do that. It's my house." "Legally, you're absolutely right," she said, "but practically, if you are not there to stop him, and if people assume you've permanently moved into care, he can get away with quite a lot." Jessica slid a few printed pages across the table to us. Margaret picked them up, studying every word as if looking for hidden meaning. Then she turned to me, serious and steady. "Beulah, I need to ask you something important. Have you given your son power of attorney?" "No," I said quickly. "Robert and I talked about it years ago, but we never actually did it." "Good," Margaret said with a firm nod. "That means he has no legal authority to make decisions about your property." Her eyes narrowed. "But he's acting like he does." We spent the rest of the morning tucked away in the nursing home's tiny library, surrounded by dusty books and the hum of an old ceiling fan. Margaret patiently explained things I'd never even thought to question. Property rights, tenant law, the difference between guardianship and power of attorney. "The bottom line," she said, "is that your house is still your house. Your son is essentially squatting in it and illegally subletting rooms." I shook my head helplessly. "But what can I do? I'm stuck in here." Margaret's eyes glinted with something fierce. "Oh, honey, you're not stuck anywhere. You came here because your son told you to, but you can choose to leave anytime you want." "Leave?" The word echoed in my mind like a foreign language. "But Randall said a lot of things," Margaret cut in, "and none of them are legally binding." She leaned forward, her voice low but full of urgency. "Beulah, you're not here by court order. You're not here because a doctor declared you incompetent. You're here because your son convinced you it was necessary. Well, now you know it wasn't." That afternoon, Margaret helped me place a call to Mrs. Patterson, my next-door neighbor. My palms were damp as I dialed. I hadn't spoken to her since Randall moved me into Sunset Manor, and I wasn't sure I was ready for what she might tell me. "Beulah," Mrs. Patterson's voice was warm but laced with concern. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you. How are you settling in at that place?" "I'm fine," I lied. "But I wanted to ask you something. Have you noticed anything unusual at my house?" There was a pause. "Well," she began slowly, "there's been a lot of activity over there. Your son and his wife moved in, of course. But then there have been other people too, strangers coming and going." My hand trembled as I tightened my grip on the phone. "What kind of strangers?" "Young people mostly, college age. They've been carrying boxes and furniture into the house. And that dog of theirs barks all night long. I've had to keep my bedroom window shut just to get any sleep." Margaret, sitting beside me, was already scribbling notes, her expression darkening with every word. "Mrs. Patterson," I asked carefully, Did Randall ever mention that I might be coming back home? Coming back? She sounded surprised. Oh no, dear. He told me you'd decided to move permanently into assisted living. Said you were much happier there and that you didn't want to deal with the house anymore. When I hung up, I sat frozen, unable to speak. Margaret reached across the table and took my hand in hers. I'm sorry, Beulah. I know that's hard to hear. I swallowed. He told her I was happy here, that I didn't want to deal with my own house anymore. Margaret's jaw tightened. He's been telling a lot of people a lot of things. She turned her notepad toward me. Based on what your neighbor said, it sounds like he's renting rooms to multiple tenants. If they're each paying $2,000 a month and he's got 3 or 4 renters, that's $6,000 to $8,000 every month. The math hit me like a punch. My house, my money. And while you're paying $3,000 a month to stay here, Margaret added, a cold weight settled in my stomach. Margaret, I can't afford to stay here much longer. I've been using my savings, but at $3,000 a month, how much do you have left? She asked. Maybe enough for 2 more months. She was silent for a long moment. Then quietly, Beulah, what did you think would happen when your money ran out? I stared at my hands. I was trying not to think about that. I assumed Randall would help, or maybe I'd apply for Medicaid. And where did you think you'd live if you couldn't afford this place? The question was like a physical blow. I'd never truly considered that Randall might not take me back. In my mind, this nursing home was temporary, just until I got used to the idea of needing help. But if he was making thousands renting out my house, why would he want his mother back? He never intended for me to come home, I whispered. Margaret nodded grimly. I don't think he did. That evening, after dinner, we sat in our shared room. Margaret pulled a yellow legal pad onto her lap and began writing. What are you doing? I asked. Making a plan, she said without looking up. Your son thinks he's outsmarted you, Beulah. He thinks you're just a helpless old woman who'll do whatever he tells you to do. Finally, she looked at me, and there was steel in her eyes. Tomorrow, she said, we're going to... Margaret's plan was as sharp as it was simple, the kind of idea that felt both obvious and ingenious once you heard it. She didn't waste a minute. The next morning, she picked up the phone and called someone she'd known for years, a real estate attorney who specialized in messy property disputes. David, it's Margaret Sullivan. I need a favor for a friend, she said briskly, pacing across the tiny room we shared like a caged tiger that had just scented freedom. Her voice took on that focused, no-nonsense tone I'd only ever heard from people who had spent decades building airtight cases. I have a 70-year-old woman whose own son has essentially stolen her house while she's in temporary care, she continued. I sat quietly and listened as she laid out my situation in precise, deliberate detail, making sure nothing could be misunderstood. By the time she hung up, there was a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. David's going to help us, she announced. He's drafting a cease and desist letter that will demand your son stop renting out your house immediately and return possession to you without delay. The words sounded like a lifeline, yet one worry still gnawed at me, the same one that had kept me awake for countless nights. But where would I go if I left here, I mean? In your own house, of course. I hesitated. But Randall says I can't manage on my own. Margaret sat down beside me on the narrow bed, her voice soft but unwavering. Beulah, honey, you've been managing your life just fine for 70 years. You spent 2 whole months in Florida caring for your sister, and you drove yourself there and back. Does that sound like someone who belongs in a nursing home? When she put it like that, it did sound absurd, and yet the fear was still there, seated deep inside me after weeks of hearing I was too frail, too helpless. What if something happens to me? I murmured. What if I fall or get sick? What if something happens to anyone? She countered immediately. Your son could get hit by a car tomorrow. Your neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, could have a heart attack next week. Living alone doesn't mean you're doomed to die alone, and living with other people doesn't guarantee you'll be safe. That afternoon, Margaret decided we needed proof. She'd arranged for David to pick us up for a little field trip. My chest tightened as the car turned down my street. I hadn't set foot there since the day I was forced out. The first thing I noticed were the cars, 4 crammed into my driveway and 2 more lining the curb in front. David pulled over across the street, and we all watched. That's a lot of cars for 2 people and a dog, Margaret observed. As we sat there, a young man I didn't recognize stepped out of my front door, a laundry basket balanced on his hip. He disappeared around to the back, and moments later I spotted my old clothesline, sagging under the weight of clothes that weren't mine. He's using my clothesline, I said, my voice catching with a strange mix of anger and disbelief. That's the least of it, David said darkly, snapping photos with his phone. Margaret told me the situation, but seeing it now. Mrs. Henderson, your son has turned your family home into a boarding house. Another stranger emerged, this one carrying a grocery bag. Then another, and another. How many people are living there? I whispered. At least 4 tenants, plus your son and daughter-in-law, David replied. Maybe more. My mind drifted through the rooms I knew so well. The living room where Robert and I had sat side by side for the evening news, where little Randall once pushed toy trucks across the carpet. Was that space now someone's bedroom? In my sewing room, the place where I'd spent hours stitching Randall's Halloween costumes and patching his school pants. What had become of it? This has to be breaking housing codes, Margaret said. Single-family homes aren't zoned for this kind of rental business. David nodded. I'll make some calls tomorrow, but first we need to lock in Mrs. Henderson's right to reclaim her property. We circled the block and came back from another direction. This time I saw Nola in the yard with Duke, the German shepherd they'd said needed my big backyard. Only, he wasn't a puppy anymore. Nearly full-grown, he was chained to a post driven straight into my front lawn. That dog is chained, I said, my stomach turning. So much for needing space to run, Margaret muttered coldly. Nola went inside, leaving Duke alone. A few minutes later, his barking began, sharp, anxious. One of the tenants stormed out and yelled at him to be quiet. This is what they reckon your life for, Margaret said, her voice tight. A chained dog and rental income. Before taking us back to Sunset Manor, David stopped at his office so I could sign the necessary documents. The cease and desist letter would go out tomorrow, giving Randall 30 days to vacate my property. What if he refuses, I asked. Then we file an unlawful detainer action, David explained. That's the legal term for evicting someone. Even if he's your son, Mrs. Henderson, the law is clear. Your house is your house. Period. That evening, Margaret helped me gather the few belongings I had at Sunset Manor. It wasn't much, just some clothes and personal items Randall and Nola had decided I needed. Where's your jewelry? Margaret asked, her eyes narrowing when she noticed. I packed only a plain wristwatch and my wedding ring. I wasn't even sure why. When I'd asked Nola about my jewelry box, she'd casually told me they'd put it somewhere safe. Margaret's jaw tightened at that. We'll add that to the list of things we're taking back, she said firmly. As I folded my clothes, my mind wandered to all the things I had lost. Not just the items with a price tag, but the ones that carried pieces of my life inside them. The photo albums that traced Randall's growing up years, my mother's china set with its delicate flowers painted by hand, the quilt my grandmother had stitched with her own hands. Robert's tools, still sitting in the garage the last time I'd seen them. Margaret, I murmured, my voice trembling a little. What if they've sold everything, or just thrown it away? Then they'll replace it, or pay you for it, she replied without hesitation. Beulah, your son committed theft. Being family doesn't magically make it legal. I had never framed it that way before. In my mind, family disagreements were simply that, disagreements. But Margaret was right. Randall hadn't just moved my things around. He had taken my home, my possessions, my life without my permission. That wasn't a misunderstanding between relatives. That was stealing. The next morning, I signed myself out of Sunset Manor. The staff looked startled, but made no move to stop me. After all, I hadn't been there against my will. Margaret came with me, deciding her own son's plans for her nursing home placement could wait. Helping me reclaim my life was now her priority. Where are we going? I asked as we slid into David's car, our suitcases tucked in the back. To a hotel, Margaret said. Just for a few days until we can get you back into your own house. A hotel? I can't afford that, I protested. You can afford that better than you can afford to keep paying for a nursing home, she shot back. Besides, David knows a place that gives seniors a good discount. As we drove away from Sunset Manor, a strange sensation washed over me. Something I hadn't felt in a month. I felt like myself again. Not a burden, not someone to be monitored or managed, just Beulah Henderson, a woman who owned a house and had every right to live in it. When we pulled into the hotel parking lot, my phone rang. The caller ID made my stomach knot. Randall, Margaret said, her eyes narrowing. He got the letter. Good. Answer it. Let's hear what he has to say now. The phone kept ringing, his name flashing on the screen. My hands shook, but Margaret gave me a small nod. Go on, she whispered. You're the one holding the cards now. I pressed accept with a finger that still trembled. Hello, Randall. Mom, what the hell is this? His voice was sharp with anger, nothing like the calm, reasonable tone he'd used when he first put me in the nursing home. Some lawyer just handed me papers saying I have to get out of your house. This is insane. It's my house, Randall. I never gave you permission to rent it out. You're in a nursing home. You don't need the house anymore. I'm not in a nursing home anymore. I checked myself out this morning. A long silence. When he finally spoke again, his voice was different, edged with panic. Mom, you can't just leave like that. You need supervision. You could hurt yourself. I've been taking care of myself for 70 years, Randall. I think I can manage. Where are you staying? You can't go back to the house. There are people living there now. I know exactly who's living there. 4 renters, each paying you $2,000 a month, plus you and Nola. That's $8,000 a month, all from my property. Another stretch of silence. Mom, listen, we can work this out. You don't understand the situation. Then explain it to me. He took a deep breath. The house needed work. The roof was leaking. The furnace was making noises. We had to put money into it to keep it from falling apart. The renters are helping us cover those costs. Margaret was scribbling furiously in her notebook, shaking her head. She turned it toward me, lies, written in big block letters. Randall, the roof was fixed 2 years ago, and the furnace was serviced right before I left for Florida. Well, there were other problems. And anyway, the renters are students. They needed a place to live, and we were helping them out. While helping yourselves to $8,000 a month, I said flatly. It's not that simple. His voice was rising now. Mom, you have no idea how expensive everything is. Nola lost her job last month, and my hours got cut at the insurance company. We needed the income. For a brief second, an old feeling stirred in me. Sympathy. My son was struggling financially. I understood that. But then I remembered the nursing home bills, the way they brushed aside every concern I voiced, and the utter disregard for my wishes. So you solved your money problems by stealing my house? I didn't steal anything. You're my mother. When you die, the house comes to me anyway. I'm just managing it early. The coldness of that sentence knocked the air out of me. When I die, Randall, I'm not dead. I'm not even sick. But you're old, Mom. You could go anytime. Car accident, heart attack, stroke. At least this way, I'm making sure the house is being taken care of. At that, Margaret snatched the phone from my hand. This is Margaret Sullivan, Mrs. Henderson's legal advisor, she said sharply. You have 30 days to vacate the... Margaret's voice was steady but edged with steel as she spoke into the phone. You need to vacate the property and return every single one of Mrs. Henderson's belongings, as outlined in the cease and desist order. From my seat, I could clearly hear Randall's outraged reply, his tone booming even through the small speaker. Who the hell are you? I'm a retired attorney, Margaret answered without hesitation, and I've dealt with more than my fair share of sons like you. You're hardly the first to believe you could manipulate an elderly parent out of their own home. This is none of your business, he snapped back. It became my business, she shot back calmly, the moment your mother came to me and asked for help. So here's where we stand. You can either comply with a legal notice or we move forward with formal eviction proceedings. Your choice. Margaret returned the phone to me, her expression unreadable. From the other end, Randall's voice came through ragged with barely contained fury. Mom, you can't let some stranger turn you against your own family. My family, I said quietly, turned me against my family. Margaret is just helping me stand up for myself. This is ridiculous, he argued. You can't just throw us out onto the street. You threw me out, I reminded him evenly, over a dog that's now chained up in my own front yard. That dog needs exercise, I added, letting the words hang in the air for a beat. And he needs a new home, along with your 4 renters and you. I could hear Nola's voice in the background, high-pitched and tight with panic. Then Randall came back on the line, his tone shifting. Mom, let's meet somewhere, just you and me. No lawyers. Let's talk about this like adults. Margaret was already shaking her head firmly, signaling me not to agree, but something inside me hesitated. Maybe, just maybe, if I could look Randall in the eye and tell him exactly how deeply he'd hurt me, he would finally see the damage he had caused. Okay, I said at last. Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, Denny's, Route 9. Good, he replied quickly. And Mom, don't bring the lawyer. After I hung up, Margaret's gaze was full of concern. Beulah, that man is going to try to manipulate you. I know, I admitted. but I need to see him face to face and tell him how this has made me feel. Maybe he'll understand, and if he doesn't, at least I'll know I tried. The next morning, I arrived at Denny's a full 15 minutes early. I picked a booth with a clear view of the parking lot, habit born of both caution and a desire to read his body language before he even stepped inside. Margaret had wanted to come with me, but I'd insisted this meeting needed to be just between a mother and her son. Randall's car pulled in exactly at 10, but he didn't get out right away. I watched him sitting there, phone pressed to his ear, speaking intently, most likely to Nola, no doubt rehearsing whatever version of events he planned to present to me. When he finally walked in, I was startled. He looked nothing like the confident, defiant man who had forced me out of my own home. His hair was unkempt, his clothes rumpled, and there was a gray weariness about him, as if he hadn't slept properly in days. "Hi, Mom," he said as he slid into the booth across from me. "Hello, Randall." For a moment, we simply looked at each other. I saw not just the man in front of me, but the little boy I'd once held through nights of fever and fear. The boy I'd cheered for on the baseball field. The young man whose college graduation had filled me with pride. Somewhere along the way, that boy had vanished, replaced by this stranger. "Mom, I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice low. "I know this whole thing has been hard on you." "Hard on me?" I kept my tone even. "Randall, you took my house. You took my belongings. You told people I was happy living in a nursing home when you knew I was miserable. I thought it was for the best." "No," I corrected him softly but firmly. "You thought it was convenient. There's a difference." He dragged a hand through his hair, looking suddenly younger and more uncertain. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under. Nola's been talking about leaving me if we can't fix our financial problems. My job's hanging by a thread. The house was just sitting there empty while you were in Florida." "It wasn't empty," I said, my voice steady. "It was waiting for me to come home. But you were gone for 2 months. How was I supposed to know you were coming back?" I stared at him. "Because I told you I was helping Eleanor recover from surgery. Because I called you every week. Because that's what the word temporary means." Randall shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Look, maybe I made some mistakes, but we can fix this. You can move back in. We'll make room." "Make room," I repeated slowly, "in my own house? The renters have leases. We can't just kick them out, but there's the guest room." "The guest room," I said, feeling a cold heaviness settle in my chest. "In my own house. It would just be temporary until we figure something else out." Even now, caught, confronted, he still imagined I would agree to be a guest in the home I had built, lived in, and loved for years. "Randall," I said quietly, "do you love me?" The question seemed to throw him. "Of course I love you, Mom. You're my mother." "Then why," I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, "did you hurt me so badly?" He was silent for a long time. Finally, he said, "I didn't mean to hurt you. I needed the house." And there it was, the raw, simple truth. He needed the house more than he needed me to be happy. I stood, pulling a $5 bill from my purse and placing it on the table to cover my coffee. 30 days, Randall. That's what the legal notice says. "Mom, wait." But I was already walking away. Some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. As I reached the door, his voice called after me, desperate now. "Mom, please, I'm begging you." But it was too late for begging. This was no longer about forgiveness. It was about consequences. The 30 days passed like the slow but inevitable clearing of a storm. During the first week, Randall called incessantly, leaving a stream of voicemails that swung wildly from guilt to anger, from pleading to bargaining, and finally to outright threats. He tried everything except truly owning what he had done. Randall had warned he'd fight the eviction, claiming I wasn't mentally competent, insisting no judge would ever side with me against my own son. Margaret only smiled, calmly adding each of his voicemails to her growing evidence file. "Let him try," she said with quiet confidence. "We've got the documentation of his illegal rental scheme, the witness statements from your neighbor about the disruption he's caused, and the photos of the property damage." By the third week, the call stopped. David, our attorney, later told us Randall had hired his own lawyer and was trying to negotiate. But the facts were simple and undeniable. I owned the house. I had never given him permission to rent it out. He had no legal right to stay. On day 29, a text popped up from an unfamiliar number. "Your stuff is on the front porch. Hope you're happy." That afternoon, Margaret and I drove to my house in a U-Haul truck David had helped arrange. I hadn't set foot there since the day we'd driven by to see what Randall was up to. My heart pounded harder with every turn, and when we finally turned onto my street, I almost didn't recognize the place. It wasn't just the boxes and furniture piled haphazardly on the front porch. The whole house seemed smaller, shrunken somehow. It no longer radiated warmth. It looked less like the home I had poured myself into for decades and more like just another anonymous house on the block. The moment I stepped out of the truck, Mrs. Patterson hurried across her yard toward me. "Bula, oh, thank goodness you're back." She wrapped me in a fierce hug. "I was so worried about you. That son of yours told everyone you'd moved permanently into a care facility, but I never believed it." "I'm home now," I said. The words surprised me with how good they felt in my mouth. Solid, real, final. "And not a moment too soon," she replied darkly. "The noise from those young people, the parties, the music all night, and that poor dog barking without end. I even called the city about the zoning violations. Single-family homes aren't supposed to be boarding houses, you know. The inspector came last week and issued citations." Margaret was already on the porch, examining the boxes, checking what was there. "Bula, come look at this," she called. I walked over to find her holding a photograph, my wedding portrait, tossed carelessly into a box of kitchen utensils. The glass was cracked. The frame was bent. "They didn't even have the decency to pack things properly," Margaret said, her voice tight with anger. We spent the next 4 hours sorting through the mess stacked on the porch. Some of my belongings were there, but many were simply gone. My grandmother's quilt, my jewelry box, my mother's china, Robert's tools, none of them were anywhere in sight. "We'll send David a list of everything missing," Margaret said. "They'll have to account for it or replace it." When we began carrying boxes inside, I braced myself, but nothing could have prepared me for what I saw. My beautiful home, the one I'd cared for and kept immaculate for 43 years, had been transformed into something that looked like a college frat house. The hardwood floors I'd polished every week were scraped and stained. Holes pocked the walls where posters had been tacked up and ripped down. The kitchen counters were burned and scratched. In the living room, where Robert and I had spent quiet evenings reading together, someone had built a makeshift bar. Empty beer bottles lined the windowsill like some grim little trophy display. "Oh, honey," Margaret murmured when she saw my face. Room by room, I took in the damage. My bedroom had been converted into a cramped dorm-style space with 3 single beds jammed inside. The upstairs bathroom mirror was shattered, and the sink had been caulked over so many times it resembled an abstract sculpture. But the worst was my sewing room, my sanctuary. The shelves Robert had built for my fabric and supplies were bare. Every drawer, every bin, every basket, empty. Even my sewing machine was gone. I sat heavily on one of the few chairs still left, and the tears came. Not the broken, helpless sobs I'd cried back at Sunset Manor, but hot, furious tears. Tears for the years of care that had been trampled. Tears for the memories stolen. Tears for what could never be replaced. Margaret sat beside me and took my hand. "We'll fix it," she said with steel in her voice. "All of it. Every scuff mark, every hole in the wall, every missing thing. And Randall is going to pay for every last penny." And that's exactly what happened. David filed a lawsuit against Randall for property damage and theft. The list of missing and damaged items added up to more than $30,000. Randall's lawyer tried to talk Margaret into a compromise, but she didn't waver. "He stole from his own mother," she said flatly. "Let him face the consequences." 2 months later, the settlement came through. Randall would pay for all the damages, replace every missing item, cover my legal fees, and pay 3 months of hotel costs while the repairs were made. I never heard from him directly again. Everything went through the lawyers. Part of me mourned the relationship we'd lost, but a larger part of me felt only relief. I was free from the exhausting obligation of pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. Margaret, too, decided she wouldn't return to her son's house. "If he wants to see me," she said, She found a place just 2 blocks away from my home, a small, cozy apartment that instantly felt like part of our world. From then on, we became the kind of family you choose for yourself, not the one you happen to be born into. The house renovations took a full 3 months. I had every hardwood floor carefully refinished until they gleamed like they hadn't in decades. The walls were freshly painted in warm, welcoming tones, and the kitchen, was completely transformed. New cabinets, new countertops, everything spotless and modern. By the time it was finished, The house looked better than it had in years, maybe better than ever. When the day finally came for me to move back in, Mrs. Patterson appeared at my door with a homemade casserole cradled in her arms and a bottle of wine tucked under the other. She smiled warmly and said, "Welcome home, for real this time." That evening, Margaret and I sat together in my newly restored living room, the air carrying the faint scent of fresh paint and polished wood. I let myself sink into the moment, thinking back over everything that had brought me here. 6 months earlier, I'd been nothing more than a lonely widow, quietly living out my days in the family home. Then my life had taken a cruel turn. I'd been pushed aside, treated like an inconvenience, shipped off to a nursing home while my own son made use of my house for his gain. But now I was something else entirely. I was a woman who had fought her way back, a woman who had stood her ground, a woman who had discovered that sometimes the family you choose is far stronger than the one you're born into. The phone rang, its sudden sound cutting through my thoughts. I glanced at the caller ID and my heart skipped a beat. Randall. Margaret's eyes flicked to mine. "Are you going to answer it?" she asked softly. I sat there for a long moment, the silence stretching between us. Then I reached over, pressed the button, and turned the phone off. "No," I said firmly. "I don't think I am. Some bridges, once burned, are better left in ashes. And some second chances come with a price too high to pay." I was home now, truly home, and I intended to keep it that way. Outside, the sun was setting over the neighborhood I'd called mine for 43 years. In the yard, the rose bushes I had planted so long ago were in bloom again, their petals opening in soft defiance, having survived both a harsh winter and months of neglect. Just like me, they had found a way to thrive, despite everything that had tried to destroy them. Margaret lifted her glass of wine. "To new beginnings," she said. I clinked my glass gently against hers. "To coming home," I replied. And for the first time in months, I felt those words all the way down to my soul.